Since the beginning of this nation, we have attempted to make a moral and psychological analysis of prejudice, the economic and social degradation to which it has led, and I'm afraid we are still doing so. Even amongst the so-called young Negro revolutionaries today, certainly this has been true of whites throughout our history, we have behaved as if the problem were a psychological one and one of just plain hatred to the Negro. It was never such, and it is not now such, and we will not deal with the problems in the future as such. Now, in order to make clear what I'm saying, I want to give a few examples. Thomas Jefferson awoke one night in a sweat. He had just had a nightmare. What was that nightmare? That he had seen the flag of the United States being torn asunder, Negroes pulling on one end as slaves and whites pulling back, and the nation was torn to bits. He rose from his nightmare, sat down at his desk, took a pen, and created a moral response. That is to say, he wrote that on his death, the slaves should be manumitted, that they should be set free. Therein you have the basic problem that has plagued us from the beginning. Jefferson did not do what he ought to have done, noble as the manumitting of his slaves was at his death. No one here could be against that. What he should have done if the Civil War was truly not to rend this nation to bits, in the most vicious battle that has ever taken place, making what is happening in Vietnam look like peanuts, morally. He should have made a moral response which led to political conclusions. He should therefore have gone into Congress with a program and a political, meaningfully program for the elimination of slavery. But it remained a moral attitude. As great as the abolitionists were, they too made the same mistake. They were all against slavery because it is morally wrong. But name for me one abolitionist who had an economic and social program for what was to be done when that war concluded, and who in the process of that war projected an economic and social program. It is often said that Negroes have no program. We have always had an economic and political program. It was we who said, we want 40 acres and a mule in order to start life again when slavery is finished. The abolitionists turned their backs on any economic and social program. They got tired and they disappeared into thin air. Even today, the radical young Negroes, whom I understand, have affection for and have worked with, and who I profoundly respect, nevertheless are making the same basic mistake. The argument being, we want black power, whatever that is, with no real definition of it. We want self-respect. We want Negro dignity, all of which I am in favor of. But it is another blind alley, because dignity and self-respect must spring from the economic and social position which you hold in the society, and cannot be mythologically and viscerally created out of some new response of dignity, where the objective situation indeed makes dignity impossible. In Nigeria today, there is as brutal behavior on the part of blacks to blacks as there is any place else in the world at the moment. I say, my dear friends, that no economic or social order has ever been developed on the basis of color. It must be developed on the basis of class. Because no social movement can be built fundamentally on color. What we must see is that all men are capable of being brutal, that the likelihood is that if the proposition were reversed, Negroes would have been as brutal as whites. And if one sees the universality of the possibility of brutality and racism, then one looks somewhere else for answers to problems. The problem is simple. Since racism is basically possible in all groups, the problem is, do you build an economic and social structure which has so much injustice in it that racism is raised from the bottom and socially and politically organized? Or do you build the kind of economic and social order which reduces the possibility of that prejudice to an irreducible minimum where it cannot be politically and socially organized? Because the problem is not plain prejudice which is there in all people. It is that the economic and social order where there are not enough jobs in this society, where there is not enough housing in this society, where there is not enough medical care in this society, a society in which the lower middle-class whites are up to here economically and are therefore more filled with economic fear than Negroes are with frustration. If, on the other hand, there had been adequate housing, if there were adequate jobs, if this nation were not insisting upon a 4% unemployment rate as being good for the society, no matter how much prejudice there was at the bottom, it could not have expressed itself in political organization. Therefore, in order that I can help us understand the nature of the situation, I'm going to divide the problem into two parts. I shall refer to period 1, by which I mean the period from the Montgomery bus protest to the passage of the Voter Rights Bill. I shall refer then, in contrast, to period number 2, which is the period we are now in. In period number 1, we were fighting almost exclusively for those things which affected Negroes alone. The right to vote, which any white person had. The right for public accommodations, which all white people had. They were the true great thrusts of that period. That's what the Montgomery bus protest was about. That's what the Freedom Rides were about. That's what the sit-ins were about. That's what the March on Washington was about, etc. That's what about Selma was about. Birmingham was about. Now I want you to note in the present period, we are dealing with practically no fundamental question in the minds of Negroes, which are Negro problems. For what Negroes are now interested in is decent housing, decent jobs, decent education, and the right of participation in decision-making. They are the four great demands of the Negro people today. But those demands are the result of basic contradictions in our society and not demands to brutalize the Negro. Now, when we learn that, we will learn a great deal about strategy and tactics. This society never has and never will do anything special for the Negro. That is the reason we call it the freedom budget for all Americans. It is not that I do not know that Negroes are most brutalized by poverty, for they are. But I also know that 67% of the poor are white, and that unless we're going to draw up programs which have to do with the elimination of poverty and not concerned with Negro poverty, we will not get anywhere in this society. If this society were now prepared to do something special for Negroes, it would not have been required that something special be done for Negroes. That is just the problem. Number two, in the first period, 55 to 65, the nature of American pressure on the Negro community would not permit the class struggle to emerge in the Negro community. Ralph Bunche couldn't vote some places, he couldn't eat some places, and where he couldn't eat, neither could the sharecropper. But now you come along with a civil rights bill giving all Negroes the right to use public accommodations and to vote. And what this means is that Negroes who have money, who are economically independent enough, can vote, and those who don't cannot. Negroes who have money to use hotels, theaters, and restaurants can use them, and those who don't cannot. Thus, for the first time now, we are not only faced with the caste problem vis-a-vis the whites, but equally vicious is now the internal class problem within the Negro community. So that at Watts they said to me, Mr. Rustin, you're a house nigger. Why don't you go on back to New York? Nothing you can do to talk to us. Same thing for you, Martin Luther King, because you niggers have made it, and we haven't. The class problem means that not only must Negroes now fight for their rights in the general society, but that those Negroes who do not have it are as angry at Negroes who have made it as they are at whites who have it. That is a very new element in the picture. Thirdly, when you talk in the early period about the right to vote and about the right to eat in public accommodations, you are talking about something that the government doesn't have to put up any money for, except when Medgar Evers gets shot, they send some police out to see if they can find who shot him. Or if Martin King's having a demonstration, the federal government may send in a few marshals to watch. In the current period, since no city, including Boston, has money to put its unemployed back to work, since no city, including Boston, has enough money for a decent educational system, since no city, including Boston, can in fact find an answer to the problem of housing without federal aid, this is a period where billions of dollars must come from the federal government if anything at all is to occur. In the early period, make no joke about it, I sat with Negro leaders night after night during those 10 years planning. We did not create the dynamic of that revolution from 55 to 65. That dynamic for the revolution was created by Bull Connor and his dogs and his fire hoses and the killing of people and the bombing of churches. In this new period, the Negro people cannot be unified by Bull Connor's dogs, and white support cannot be created by Southern brutality, because it isn't going to exist anymore in the form it did. That means, therefore, that we must now create the dynamic for that change ourselves. The point I'm making is there are times when negative factors in the society can congeal things. This is a time where negative factors in the community pull things apart. In the old period, all the youngsters needed was bravery and perseverance. They just sat at the restaurants, they swam in the swimming pools, no matter what they did to them. They arrested them, they'd come back, they beat them, they'd come back, and finally you get a breakthrough. No young Negroes today, with mere courage and perseverance, are going to make any contribution. For in this period, one needs an analysis of politics, one needs an analysis of the processes of social change, one needs to know how to build alliances, one needs to know sociology, economics, and psychology, and the old leadership is dead. And a part of the shenanigans which you now see is the interim period, where some youngsters still think that they have now transferred their speech-making at Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery to national television. But they will tell us nothing about the nature of social change, nor do they have a program, economic, social, or political. Now there's one other factor. In the old period, we were coasting on an internal psychological wave that was moving toward progress. That is to say, if you had asked any individual in this nation, particularly the university, what is the most compelling problem we face between 55 and 65? Invariably, they would have said the civil rights movement. Since 65, we have been moving against the psychological concern of the liberal forces of this nation. If you now ask the average American what is the most compelling problem, he will say, ending the war in Vietnam, and he is right. So that psychologically, the war in Vietnam has trapped us. It has split the civil rights movement down the middle. It has caused many white people who were in it to say, that must wait now until we stop Vietnam. And it has made it possible for a congressional backlash, which is always going to fight progress. The war has given them a patriotic platform on which to stand for the stopping of that progress. And let me say here, lest there be some confusion, the notion that we can do nothing about the domestic problems until we deal with Vietnam is vicious. It is precisely what Goldwater and Eastman say. And if anyone expects me to go back to the ghetto and tell Negroes that I've just been talking with my white liberal friends who have convinced me that nothing for you can be done till the war in Vietnam is over, then I think I must have holes in my head. Now, finally, in this regard, my dear friends, there is something else. The period from 55 to 65 was a period of faith. We shall overcome, we shall never turn back, we shall never be turned around. Martin Luther King had a dream on August 28, 1963. No Negroes have a dream today. They're all having nightmares. This is not a period of hope. This is a period of despair. And make no confusion about it. While we cannot get rid of rioting unless we do something now about housing, schools, and jobs, and representation, it was not bad housing, bad schools, bad jobs, and the absence of participation which caused the riots. The riots were caused by hopelessness, that nobody believes in the Negro community that tomorrow, or a week from next Thursday, or a year from now, or 10 years from now, that there will be full employment, that there will be the destruction of slums, that there will be public health measures, that there will be decent schools, that there will be representation. That was the cause of the riots, the hopelessness. Now I come, therefore, to the freedom budget, because the freedom budget is for the purpose of restoring hope in a situation. The freedom budget is very simple. It says, number one, while we are all for everything which has been done in the war on poverty, and while we must fight it now, the war on poverty never could have worked to eliminate poverty, because, my friends, the only way to eliminate poverty is to see that the heads of families of the poor are economically independent. Now, I love children, and I think something needs to be done for 17-year-olds. But to send youngsters to Job Corps to graduate where there are no jobs, and you know there are no jobs before you send them there, is to build Molotov cocktails and send them back into the ghettos. Now, I love children, and I'm all for Head Start as far as it goes. But anybody ought to know that you can't have a Head Start and then send the children back to the same ghetto schools, the same houses with rats and roaches, the same teachers who cannot care, the same parents who are separated, and think you've done something. Just the opposite has been proven. But my friends, this is what we know from the Italians and Irish, who are two groups who had very similar problems of high crime rate, family instability, and all the other things which are described in the Moynihan Report. The society created objective situations which made it possible for the heads of those families to gain economic independence. And as the heads of families gained economic independence, all of the problems in the community were gradually reduced. Now, the freedom budget not only does something about children and teenagers, but it goes to the head of family. It says who is poor and what significance does it have. All this talk that you university people do about disadvantaged and acculturated and lay off it. There is only one difference between a man who is rich and one who is poor. One has money and one does not. Now, if poverty is a problem, ladies and gentlemen, let's face it. The freedom budget says, put money into the hands of the poor so that they can no longer be described as poor. For something will happen when they get money. Now, in case there are any dyed-in-the-wool capitalists here, I want to reassure you. The first thing they're going to do when they get this money is to go out and buy the filthy junk you produce and advertise on television. Now, that may sound like a joke, but this is a part of the economic theory I'm expounding. That to the degree that we put money in their hands and they go out and buy televisions and shoes and baby carriages and toothbrushes and toothpaste and the kind of perfume men use to get rid of pimples so the girls will love them, When they buy all these things, our gross national product increases. And it is from that gross national product that we want to get this money for the freedom budget. Now, you take a small group of Negroes working on housing in Newark, New Jersey. They think because they get together and vote Mrs. Smith onto some board that that's real democratic participation. It is possible only if we can get a freedom budget in which the United States is committing billions of dollars to being sent into Newark. Otherwise, Mrs. Jones is sitting on a committee voting in the vacuum that no matter what those Negroes on that committee decide, it ultimately doesn't make any difference because there isn't any money anyhow. So I am saying that in the process of insisting on the right to be heard and to help make decisions, that is a process of masturbation unless it is overall covered by a financial policy and priorities in the nation that is meaningful. The freedom budget stands for the change of priorities, national planning, the government becoming the employer of last resort, the government becoming the houser of last resort, the dedication of putting sufficient money into people's pockets so that they can live in this affluent society with dignity, free education, free medical care. Let me just say in conclusion, my friends, that we are up against the most difficult period of American history that we have ever faced. There are elements in this society, in the Negro community, which out of a developing manhood, and not because they are devils, would in fact prefer to see this society destroyed and the cities burned down if they cannot have respect. We have got to make our peace with this. And the only way we can give them that respect is not by urging them to study Swahili, and not by urging them to collect African art, and not by appeasing them. It is by coming into the battle to fight for those economic and social demands which alone can bring freedom to the poor and relieve the Negro, the most desperately poor of all.